Well, 9950X and 9900X launch time. What a time to be alive. For good and bad reasons.
We interrupt this video to bring you a special message from iFixit. No, we interrupt this interruption with this interruption about new stuff from iFixit. Wish you had a new graphics card, but inventory sucks? Fix the inventory problems with iFixit. Whoa, don't drop it. Can't fix that with iFixit. Just kidding, yes you can. Wish you could take iFixit with you anywhere, but your pockets aren't big enough? Introducing the new More
and the new Minnow.
Take them with you anywhere. So get iFixit for your loved ones, or just get them for yourself.
All right, everyone, Jay here. Spent the last week, solid week, of just about every single day and weekend testing every CPU you see on this table right here. 9950X is AMD's new flagship CPU for the mainstream market. So not to be confused with Threadripper or anything like that. Obviously designed to replace the 7950X. Probably not really designed to replace any of the X3D CPUs as a gaming CPU, with the exception like the 9700X, which is a different review. They were targeting the 5800X 3D with that. We're gonna talk today specifically about professional work case or workloads. We're gonna talk about multi-threading and gaming in this review. All right, so just to recap high level specs here, the 9950X is a 16 core, 32 thread part. The 9900X is a 12 core, 24 thread. And then the 9700X and 9600X we talked about in a different review, 8, 16, and 612 respectively. Core clocks actually get a little bit of a boost on this one, up to 5.7 gigahertz max boost on the 9950X and 5.6 gigahertz on the 9900X. Base clocks also lifted 100 megahertz respectively, 4.3 for the 9950 and 4.4 for the 9900. So it's got 100 megahertz higher base clock on the 9900X, but a 100 megahertz slower max clock. So they kind of squish it in, whereas you got a little bit wider range on the 9950X. So cache, it's a total of 80 megabytes available for the 9950X. That's split between 16 megs on the L2 and 64 megs on the L3. 9900X is a 12 meg L2 and 64 meg L3 for a total of 76 megabytes on the 9900X. Now power limits on the 9950X are essentially unchanged from the previous generation, of course being the 7950X. 175 watt core max with a total of 200 watt PPT. That's the total power package. And then we get a pretty significant efficiency increase as we move forward to the 9900X. So they dropped that from 170 watts down to 120 watts. Now the 9700X and 9600X we've already talked about dropped from 105 down to 65. But the PPT limits on the 9900X are 162 watts, which is essentially the same as what you find on like a 7950X 3D. So we've gotten some efficiency improvements on the 9900X part, but not the 9950X. Max memory speed for non-OC is up to 5600 megahertz. JDEC is also 5600 megahertz, but they're actually saying with the improvements to the 9000 series memory controller and with the new AGESA, they can actually support up to 8000 megahertz DIMMs. Now for our testing right here, I'm gonna get beat up for it, I already know. I'm running 5200 megahertz CL36 RAM. Not because of the fact that I wanted to, but because when I looked up at the start of all this testing, I saw that the official max supported guaranteed RAM speed that you will get out of 7000 series and up is 5200 megahertz. Now we will be redoing every single test you see on this chart with 6000 megahertz memory, maybe even higher with the 9000 series, so we can actually see what memory speed improvements look like on 7000 series and 9000 series and older CPUs. So my quote unquote mistake, which is not technically a mistake as far as I'm concerned, it still shows somebody that may have older generation DDR5 that they got when AM5 first came out and they're looking to upgrade to a 9000 series processor and they don't want to buy fast RAM, they already have this. It gives them an idea of what kind of like their baseline performance would be in the worst case scenario. I like to show worst case scenarios as much as possible because if you get more than that, that's a bonus. If you expect more and you get less, that's a problem. Anyway, excuses aside, that will turn into another piece of content. That's gonna allow me to actually show you what the faster RAM did for these tests, if anything. I'm really curious to see which tests benefit from the fast RAM, probably games, versus the more baseline kind of a 5200 megahertz. So when it comes to the transistor count, it's pretty massive. 8.6 billion per CCD with 2 CCDs up to a total of 17.2 billion. If you took a number like that back to like 1992 and showed someone working on a computer back then the amount of billions of transistors you'll have in a CPU versus the millions they were working on back then, they would just think you were absolutely crazy. With that said, let's just go ahead and kind of get into the charts and run through them real quick, and then we'll go through them one at a time. Spoiler alert, it is great at productivity, and it is just when it comes to games. And there's a reason for that. In my opinion, it's a misstep in the way that the CPU is designed to operate when it comes to games versus the 7000 series. And we'll talk about it. So let's talk about pricing. This is the number one key factor for most people. I actually had to update this chart since we did the 9700X review because prices actually adjusted a little bit. Most of them started coming down since then. As you can see, the 9950X comes in at a whopping $649, just topping out the chart, with the close second place being $546 at the 14900K. Also too important to note, these are running the newest microcode for the Intel CPUs, so all the numbers you see are specifically with the new microcode, so no multi-core enhancement, it's all out of the box. Intel Extreme Profile, which is technically their baseline profile as far as we can tell. Anyway, I asked Steve, that's what he's running, I copied it, 253. If you got a problem with it, go take it up with him. Moving on, the 9900X comes in at $499. We have a $159 gap between those two. Why? You probably got to make room for the 9900X 3D, which is more than likely coming out. Unfortunately, that would mean the 9950X 3D is probably going to be more than $649 if the price doesn't drop before that CPU does. Anyway, the 7950X, which is a still very strong performing CPU in today's climate of multitasking and gaming, at $519 is an extremely appealing prospect to somebody that wants 32 threads, 16 cores, but don't want to pay nearly $130 more for it. The 7950X 3D comes in at $525, so only $6 more for those that are interested in gaming. The 14900K though, obviously coming in at $546, is the second most expensive CPU on the chart. So keep this chart in mind, because as we move forward the charts, I'm not sorting them by price, because if I did, the data was all jumbled. It was very difficult to actually make sense of that. So we do have each chart sorted by performance. All right, so Cinebench R24 single thread score, you can see here the 14900K at the 14900K at 253 watt with the latest microcode is king by 1 point. The 9950X is right behind it. Keep in mind, the 9950X does have a frequency deficit versus the Intel counterpart because of the fact that the Intel, even with the latest microcode, will still boost in single thread and two thread workloads up to 6 gigahertz, whereas it's up to 5.7 gigahertz on the 9950X. And realistically, because of voltage limits and such, we're seeing it really sit more about 5.65 gigahertz. So it's about a 350 megahertz difference between the 14900K. 9900X is actually right behind it at 132. Once again, the higher the tier of CPU goes with AMD 7000 and 9000 series CPUs, you get a higher max clock with them, which is not how it was back in the past. Moving on to R24 multi-thread though, it is nearly a dead heat between the 9950X and the 14900K, 2122 versus a 2124. And it's funny is you can actually see the pairing as you look down this graph. You got the 13900K versus the 7950X. You got the 7950X 3D actually going toe-to-toe with the 14700K. Again, the X3D has the 7950X 3D has a severe megahertz or frequency deficit versus the higher end CPUs, but the 9900X is getting beaten by it at 1703. So 7950X 3D still looks like a pretty good multi-use case type of workload where if you want gaming and you like max gaming and you want the core counts, it's a good option. 7800X 3D, which is also the Gaming King CPU, you can see it hasn't made much of a showing yet. It's third from the bottom on this chart, because it is an 8-core, 16-thread part. It's only a single CCD, and it's really designed for gaming, and that will show up later. And you all know that exactly what that's probably going to do to the competition. Cinebench R23 single thread score, same story. The 14900K is actually a decent amount in the lead. Again, frequency is king when it comes to R23. R23 in that instructions and the way that's designed to render the ray trace scene really favors frequency. Frequency is king when it comes to that test. So 2345 up to 6 gigahertz versus the 9950X's 2262, which is just behind the 13900K. Again, frequency 5.9 on that CPU, 5.8 to 5.9 on that CPU. But as soon as we move to multi-threading or multi-core, the 9950X just shoots way out there in the lead. It loves Cinebench R23 multi-core, 41,521. My CPU at home, which is a 14900K, not running the latest microcode because I've been too busy with all this crap to be able to update it, running at 320 watts with a severely overpriced water cooling system, is being beaten by this CPU. I'm pulling a 40,000 at home with that CPU, with all my stuff running in the background still, and it doesn't come anywhere close to the 41,521. If this kind of performance on the 9950X just showed up everywhere, it'd be great. Unfortunately, it doesn't. The Intel counterparts, 14900K and 13900K, are way down there at 36,519 and 35,129. Those two CPUs took a severe hit once BIOS were updated for Intel motherboards to no longer start pushing the narrative motherboard manufacturers wanted to push on the CPUs and killing them. So if we go ahead and move forward now to Blender, and these tests moving forward until we get to games is where 9950X is just king. So you can see 9950X at the top, followed by 7950X, and then 14900K and 7950X 3D are like nearly the exact same score. 229.55 versus 229.5, extremely close. Same story with Junk Shop. Basically the order stays nearly unchanged. A couple of CPUs do move around. Again, Blender, another rendering test, just absolutely loves the 9950X. We'll talk about frequencies and how they do over time when we get to the line graph section of this. But if we take a look at Handbrake, this is where Intel's just continues to sort of dominate with the raw X.264 encoder, no quick sync or anything like that. You can see that lower is better, so we put the shorter time on the top of the chart. It's not until you go down to 4th place that you get the 9950X. But the difference between the fastest CPU and the 9950X is 4 seconds. Obviously, the 7600X way down there at 117 seconds to transcode our 3-minute 4K video down to 1080p doesn't look all that appealing for multi-tasking type workloads, or multi-threaded workloads, but that's also not the point of that CPU. Moving on, we look at the one-thread performance on Geekbench. It's exactly as you'd expect, the 9950X. This is where IPC really shows. It's not one of those tests that highly favors clock speed. It dominated at 3362 with the 9700X and 9900X nearly identical right behind it. And then the 9600X then followed by the 14900K. So Geekbench really liked the new architecture. Multi-threading, same story. Dominated by the 9950X. Then our 3 Intel CPUs right behind it, and then the 7950X above the 9900. Again, really close, so an 18,897 versus an 18,837 for the 7950X and the 9900X. And the 9900X has a core count deficit versus the 7950. So that shows where even the 9900X has a very good multi-threaded workload potential. Time Spy Extreme, another CPU test that the 9950X really liked. The way this test works is it measures the amount of time in milliseconds it takes for the CPU to render the scene. So it's not an FPS, it's a millisecond to render. If we move into gaming now, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 7950X3D and the 7800X3D just decimated the field. And this is where you're gonna see that the 7800X3D CPU for gamers is still king. And until we get a 9800X3D or something like that, you're probably not gonna see it dethroned as the ultimate value for gamers for a while. But as you can see, the 14900K was even getting beaten by the 7900X3D. So I did the 7900X3D on here as well because I figured it's the type of CPU that exists for somebody that wants to game and work on the same system, don't want to spend the kind of money on a 7950X3D, but are willing to take the sacrifices you take on both sides of productivity as well as gaming. So I feel like the 7900X3D is still a very appealing CPU, but as you can see, versus the 7800X3D, not even close. Cyberpunk 2077. This is one I debated not even showing this chart, but I need your guys' help. I think I know why the numbers are the way that they are. If you look, you've got all the Intel stuff and then the AMD stuff, and there's a significant difference in performance on the average FPS between the two. So earlier this year, Project Red released an update for Cyberpunk 2077 that basically does hybrid CPU optimization. Now, Intel CPUs 12th gen and up are hybrid CPUs with efficiency cores and performance cores. So basically it's kind of working like core parking does for AMD's X3D and Vcache CPUs, where it forces the game to run on the P cores and the P cores only. That's the only reason I can imagine that the uplift is as high as it is right here, because we are running an RTX 4090 at 1080p medium settings, no DLSS, no ray tracing. We're forcing a bottleneck here. And we have a fairly significant gap. But what's most interesting to me here, and this is the part that I'm having a hard time figuring out, is the 9950X all the way down to the 5900X is only 7 FPS apart on our max FPS. Now, one thing we did to kind of make sure that things were even is we went through every single setting on both our Intel system and our AMD system, one line at a time, and everything is identical. We even tried running the AMD rig with the built-in game settings with SMT at auto, including SMT off, and we actually saw a loss in performance when we turned off SMT. So we really can't explain these numbers. And the thing that's really confusing is that we even sanity checked these numbers against some other content creators, and they're seeing similar results, only in the inverse, where Intel is losing to AMD by the same margin. They're nearly the same numbers, only backwards. But moving on, Borderlands is the other one that made us go, what the actual frick is going on here? Because Borderlands 3 is Unreal Engine 4, and we know UE4 does favor Intel CPUs. But by this much? This is what's interesting, because you have the 14.7 beating the 14.9 by only 2 FPS, and the 13.9 and the 13.7 all right there in the 345 to 360 range on max FPS. Again, 1080p medium presets. And then you gotta go all the way down, halfway down the chart before you get to the 7900 X3. Even the 7800 X3D is being beaten by like the 12900K and the 13600K. So to me, the numbers look off on this. But I cannot tell you how many times we reran these tests, how many times we verified settings, how many times we verified the amount of file integrity, drivers, clean installs of Windows. These Windows installs are very, very vanilla for the test bench, the whole benchmarking reasons. They can't have a bunch of clutter on them. But the numbers are consistent. And we even ran some of them again today to do spot check sanity testing just to see, and they still hold up. So I'm having a hard time figuring out what's happening with Borderlands 3. Now, when you compare it to AMD's charts, if you look at their footnotes, they say they're running it with a 7900 XTX, and we do know that Borderlands 3 loves Radeon architecture. In fact, when Borderlands 3 and the 7900 XTX first came out, it was absolutely destroying NVIDIA GPUs. But we didn't do Intel versus AMD side-by-side testing, so these numbers are extremely sus. Again, I'm only including these because I really want people to reach out and say, hey, this could be a reason why. Again, I have logs for these games. I'd be happy to share them. Cannot figure out what's happening here specifically regarding that title. When we move on to Horizon Zero Dawn, which is a new game title that we showed, the performance is exactly as we expect. All three X3D CPUs that we tested are at the top. 7950X followed right behind it by the 7800 X3D, followed right behind it by the 7900 X3D. So that looks exactly as we expected. And then we got the Intel CPUs after that, and then all the way down the middle of the chart is where you'll start to find the 9950X and the 9900X. Let's talk about why. And it will make sense when we look at the line graphs over time. In fact, before we go back to gaming, let's talk about multi-threaded workloads here. So what this is a 30-minute stress test for Cinebench R23 multi-core. It's a 360mm AIO running at 100% fan speed. No PBO, we'll talk about PBO at the end of this. You can see right here, there is a clock variance between CCD 0, which is the better CCD, and CCD 1, about 300 megahertz. It's a little embarrassing because it was actually going up to about 4.95 gigahertz all core on CCD 0 and 4.6 to 4.65 gigahertz all core on CCD 1. The only thing I can think is this might have something to do with some of the efficiency stuff that's put in with the CPU, because when we do the same type of test with the 7950 X3D, we get a homogenized experience where they both go to the same frequencies and maybe fluctuate 50 megahertz between the two, depending on how much power and headroom is available to it when it comes to the way that the boosting algorithm works with the 7000 series CPUs. So that core frequency difference too is what leads to some of the less than expected results when it comes to multi-threaded workloads. So when we talk about power draw, it still has a 160 amp limit, a 200 watt PPT, and 170 watt core package draw. So when we look at that same Cinebench R23 30-minute stress test, you can see it goes right up, and this is actually the core plus SoC plus miscellaneous power. It actually goes up to about 197 watts and stays there. The only time it drops is every time it reloads the test. The reason why it drops is because only 1 or 2 cores are responsible for reloading the test. Now when we look at temperatures, they're actually very, very good, especially compared to the 7950X, but you can't directly compare them to the 7950X and the 9950X 3D because the temperatures are being reported from different parts of the CPU. They changed the way that the CPU temperature is reported. So based on the way it's reporting, we can see that the CPU die average or the T die average is sitting under 75 C. A couple of spikes go above that usually when it's loading the test, but it's actually looking very good at about 73 to 75 C. How that relates to a 7000 series CPU, well, I know Steve did a really good comparison when they normalized the wattage and all that stuff to be able to see what it looks like. It's better, but again, it's a reporting change when it looks at these temperatures. Remember, the power of the 9950X is the same as the 7950X, so it just looks different with the way it's reporting. But let's talk about gaming, because that was the part that I wanted you guys to know that this is where I feel like AMD made a very interesting decision. This is a Cyberpunk 2077 30-minute stress test sitting basically idle in Night City with all the AI doing its thing and the CPU under load. The green line, as you can see, is CCD0 clock average. And you can see that that is locked at about 5.5 to 5.6 gigahertz across the board. If you look at the blue line, that's CCD1, which is handling all of the other tasks that the system has going on in the background, the low priority tasks. So you can see that's why the frequency goes up, but it goes down quite a bit as well. 9950X and 9900X have core parking just like X3D CPUs do for 7900X and 7950X, but they don't benefit from any additional cache. They're only trying to reduce latency between the CCDs, which is something we haven't seen them really try and do or struggle with since back to like Zen 1 and Zen 2 and Zen 1.5 technically. So the fact that they made the choice to park cores is an extremely curious one. I had a conversation with them on the phone about this, and basically it's just, well, we sort of reevaluated the way we did it with 7000 series, then we found that this one's gonna be beneficial without too much of a hit. So this is why when you look at gaming charts, the 9950X basically looks like a 9700X because it is. It's just removing a CCD, it's parking it for all intents and purposes where none of the game threads will move over to that CCD, so now you have an 8-core 16-thread CPU. The idea is that, again, they're reducing latency between the CCDs. And then the 9900X is basically just a 9600X because of the fact that, once again, now it has a 6-core CCD versus, 2 6-core CCDs found on the 9900. So this is I've talked to a lot of other creators to sort of get some sanity check across the board with this to determine, do you think this was a smart move? And nobody seems to be, in agreement with this move. I don't know. I think the gaming benchmarks really speak for themselves because 9950X and 9900X was losing to 7900 or 7950 and 7900X in titles as well. And that does not park cores. So anyway, last chart to talk about here, our graph is going to be power. You can see this is the core SoC miscellaneous power. Like I mentioned, this is through that same Cyberpunk 2077 30-minute run. And you can see that when loading the test, there's a big spike in power draw up over 180 watts. And then it comes down and normalizes around 130 watts and then fluctuating obviously as things in the game are happening. The game world thread is loading the NPCs and they're doing things and car crashes and shootouts and all the random stuff that happens in the background that the CPU handles. You can see that's what all those spikes are. So not an incredible high amount of power draw, about 130 watts while playing the game, but that's a far cry from what the 9700X and 9600X's 65 watt parts look like. But you're getting the same performance at a higher watt now, which is really weird. Like you lose all the efficiency benefit that you would find on a 9700X now with a 9950X pretending to be a 9700X but pulling twice the power. Anyway, there you go. That's my look at the 9950X. I know that my charts need, and my information, there needs to be more of it. I'm working on that. I hope you guys at least appreciate the type of data we presented today. And if there's stuff that you think I should be presenting that I'm not, feel free to sound off in the comments below. I'm listening to your critiques and I'm modifying the way we're doing things. I'm talking with other content creators, how they do things, so I can give you guys data that's meaningful, not just a bunch of charts that are like, here you go, make your own mind up. At the end of the day, I think the 9950X is a great CPU for someone that wants the maximum amount of multi-threaded workload or performance available and wants to still play games, I guess. It's really hard to recommend it though over the 7950X, which is pretty damn near its performance, unless you're only doing things that are the same kind of workload as Cinebench R23, which is where it absolutely dominates. But at $650, I'd rather save $130 and get a 7950X, personally. That's just me. And if you're just gaming, you would never be considering this CPU anyway. You'd be looking at the 7800X 3D, and you know that. Anyway, we did include the 5900X and 5950X on there, and we'll try and get some older Ryzen CPUs to start building out this chart. But for those of you that are basically sitting on the dead AM4 future compatibility there, that's why unfortunately the 5900X and 5950X are still pretty expensive in price, because they are the best CPUs you can get in terms of productivity on that platform. So 5800X 3D users though, don't have it on our chart, but if you look at a lot of other people's charts, it might be time to actually upgrade. But unfortunately with that comes with a new motherboard, it comes with a new RAM, you might even need a new power supply, and you can't buy all that stuff and not get a new graphics card or something like that. So you're probably gonna start a domino effect of wanting to upgrade, which is why I think a lot of people are just in a holding pattern, keeping what they've got, because a lot of these updates and a lot of these uplifts in performance are so small for most people, it's just, why spend the money? Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. Sound off down below what you think we should add to these reviews. That way you can get some more benefit out of it. As always, we'll see you in the next one. And now we get to start these tests all over again at 6,000 and faster RAM.